This is Holly Page with this week's edition of No Labels Talks with my friend and colleague, Ryan Clancy.
Hey, Holly.
Hi, Ryan.
Hey, where was my cult leader
I
introduction?
know.
You usually give me with all these extravagant adjectives about how great I am.
It is true. I do need to come up with a whole fresh 2025 list for that. But what wild times in Washington, Ryan?
Yes, there was a spending deal. Now it's dead. Now it might be revised. A lot of messiness before we get into the new Congress and new administration. That's pretty clear.
Is there any precedent of a president-elect having this type of impact before he's even in office?
I don't think so. And I mean, I know I'm not saying anything original here because about 100 different people have said this, but it is just striking how President Biden just kind of seems to have faded into the background. And meanwhile, President-elect Trump is meeting foreign leaders and CEOs and very much seems to be running the country already.
Exactly, with his wingman, Elon Musk.
Yes.
It is interesting that I feel in some ways they're, by dragging a lot of this into the light on Twitter, they are making advancements in transparency. I'm not sure it's exactly how the members of the House and Senate would like to have done it, but it's.
Yeah, this is not like, cameras in the subcommittee rooms on C-SPAN, but it is another kind of transparency and maybe it's better.
Exactly. So Ryan, as we look forward to 2025, what are you thinking the year ahead will hold for No Labels and the politics of problem solving?
Well, look, we know we just got done with our big meeting last week when we had a No Labels national meeting with 24 House and Senate members, citizens from all 50 states. I mean, it was really a great meeting. I'm not just saying that because I was there. It was just a lot of enthusiasm, and you really heard so much genuine feeling among these members that were there who want to work on things. They recognize there's going to be areas where they disagree, but whether it's immigration, whether it's permitting, whether it's some of the fiscal challenges facing the country, there is an appetite there to work on some stuff, and that's promising.
I agree. I thought as important as it was for us to hear from the members and the senators, I think it was important for them to see us. We had a packed room, many points in over the conference, it was standing room only. People had paid their own way to come and be in Washington for it. All 50 states were represented, and they could see that for the first time really ever, No Labels was able to quantify, bring together, and energize support for the politics of problem solving, give power to the middle. So
Yeah.
it's important for them to see us too.
Yes, absolutely. Well, look, even as we're continuing on with our work to organize and support this bipartisan coalition, we are continuing to try to just make sure our community is up to speed on the issues that are going to be most at the forefront early next year, which is why this month we're talking about tariffs, which, for a long time, both parties really rejected tariffs as a trade policy tool. But President Trump came in 2016 and he put in some tariffs, and President Biden really kept a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a situation where as we go into the second Trump administration, he's talking about really escalating those tariffs as a tool. We thought it would be interesting to talk with some different experts who have very different views on this. So we're starting out with Scott Lincicome from the Cato Institute, who really thinks that tariffs are the wrong tool. He described it as a 19th century tool for a 21st century economy. And so we're going to start with Scott talking about why he doesn't think this is a great idea. We're going to subsequently talk to another speaker who thinks maybe actually there is some use for these tariffs. But let's start with Scott Lincicome from Cato Institute. Hello, everyone. This is Ryan Clancy with our next edition of No Labels Talks. It's been a couple of weeks since we did this because No Labels was prepping for our big national meeting in DC last week. But we're ready now to get back to talking about some policy. And with us is somebody who knows quite a bit about what is sure to be one of the most hot button issues of the early Trump administration, which is tariffs. Scott Lincicome. Scott, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So let me tell you a little bit about Scott. He's at the Cato Institute, where he's the vice president for general economics and the Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies. He also lectures at Duke University Law School, and he was also a hands-on practitioner, having spent several decades practicing international trade law at White and Case LLP. Now, one of the interesting things we're doing this week is talking to somebody who is generally not in support of the incoming president's proposed tariffs, and somebody who is. We're going to start today with Scott, who is not really on board with a lot of the tariff proposals that President-elect Trump is suggesting. But I want to start just at the most simple place we possibly can, Scott, which is what is a tariff exactly?
Sure. Good place to start. Tariff is a tax on an imported product that enters the country. Important to note that the product actually has to come into the country before any sort of tariff is paid. So contrary to what you might hear, tariffs are not paid by foreigners abroad. They're not paid by foreign governments. They're only paid once the good is imported into the United States for consumption here.
Now, one of the things that people might not know is, it's a little bit of a fake debate to say for or against tariffs, because the United States has always had tariffs since its inception. It's really a continuum, right? I mean, how far do you want to go in one direction or another?
Yeah, and I mean, even free traders like me acknowledge at least theoretical cases for using protectionism. The most obvious and common example is national security. We shouldn't be buying military tanks and planes and that kind of stuff from, say, the Chinese or whatever. Now, there might be better ways to achieve that type of protectionism than a tariff, but in general, you're not going to see a lot of opposition from folks like me on proposals like that. And, the Defense Department has all sorts of Buy American rules, and we have subsidies for that kind of stuff. And that's all fine.
Yeah.
Really, instead, the debate comes in when we want to use tariffs for economic reasons, whether to raise revenue or to protect domestic companies and workers. And that's where I think things get a lot more divisive, and where you'll see folks like me generally in opposition.
Well, let's level set everybody, just to get an understanding of where we are. Look, tariffs were the primary source of revenue for the United States government for the first 100-something years until income and corporate taxes came on. Today, it's just about 80 billion a year, which is kind of a rounding error relative to the 4.5 trillion they take in. About 1/3 of the goods, I think, Scott, that come into the country right now are subject to tariffs, and there's an average rate of about 2%. Now, of course, what President-elect Trump is calling for is a raise to at least 10% on everything. One of the things you said about that, let me just quote you here, and maybe you can explain. You said basically tariffs like this not only impose immense economic costs, but that they often fail to achieve their primary policy aims and increase political dysfunction along the way. So talk to us about why you think jumping up from an average tariff of 2 to 10 would be really counterproductive.
Well, there's a few reasons. You start with the budgetary issues, right? So there's an inherent conflict in using tariffs to raise revenue, but also using tariffs to protect industry. And that goes back to what I said earlier, that a good has to actually enter the country for a tariff to be applied and to generate revenue. But to protect the domestic industry, you actually need to reduce import volumes, right? So if you're trying to protect the steel industry, it doesn't do the steel industry any good if there's still tons of steel coming into the country and getting tariffs. But if you really reduce the amount of imports coming into the country, well, what happens? Then you reduce the what we call tax base, or you reduce the amount of revenue you can raise. So there's this conflict, uh, constant conflict between one objective, raising revenue for tariffs, and the other objective, protecting domestic industry. So that's a big limit on the amount of money you can actually raise, because if you put 100% tariffs on all imports, you're not going to get the same amount of imports. You're actually going to get a much smaller amount of imports, and that'll have other economic implications, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But from a budgetary perspective, it's just not going to raise a ton of money.
What from your understanding, we've heard different justifications for this from people in and around President-elect Trump. So some people have said, hey, we could do tariffs and use some of that revenue to offset tax cut extensions. There's other people who say, actually, the primary reason to do this is the domestic industries we want to protect. What overall do you think is the sense of the new administration in terms of why they want to do this? What's important to them?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, quite honestly, because it depends on whom you talk to. You'll hear folks in Congress talking about it mainly as a revenue issue, and Republicans, also as a negotiating lever. But then you hear the future President Trump, and sometimes it's going to protect our great American manufacturers. Other times it's going to open up foreign markets. And then other times it's going to raise billions of dollars. And like I said, it really can't be all three. And so my guess is, at the end of the day, it's more about economic protectionism, about boosting American manufacturing. Now, there are flaws in that theory, and less about revenue. But I would note, though, that international negotiations thing we hear a lot too these days, right? You'll hear Commerce Secretary nominee Lutnick will say this is really just about getting foreign governments to lower their trade barriers. We're just going to threaten this stuff. Well, the problem there is that if all you're doing is threatening tariffs, then you're not getting any money from them, and you're not protecting domestic industries either. If you're applying them and then removing them, you don't have a consistent source of revenue or a consistent source of protection. So, in a way, tariffs for President Trump and his nominees are kind of like this Vegematic. I mean, depending on the audience, depending on the moment, they can do all sorts of things. They'll slice and dice, they'll puree, and they'll make smoothies too.
I don't think I've ever heard that analogy as described to tariffs, but I like it. That's good. One of the things you've also talked about when we're talking about tariffs, all tariffs are not created equal depending on what products are coming in, what countries they're coming in. You talked in particular about North America, because the president-elect has talked about maybe 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods if they don't do certain things. So in the case of Mexico, stemming the tide of illegal migrants and fentanyl coming over as an example. But one of the things you said is you don't think people understand just how integrated the North American supply chain is. Walk us through a couple examples of things we buy and how integrated the supply chain is in North America to get it to us.
Yeah. So, I think the place to start is food. The reality is that we trade a lot of food products, particularly with Mexico, but also with Canada. We export a lot of stuff, but we also import a lot of stuff, and particularly fresh produce. Mexico is a warmer, sunnier place than most of the United States, has longer growing seasons. And so we get billions and billions of dollars. In some cases, the vast majority of certain products, like avocados, come from Mexico. So when you apply a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, you're effectively going to be taxing avocados because there are no really other good suppliers of avocados, you're not going to be making them in the United States. We just don't have the land and the resources. Consumers are going to be paying them. That's the bottom line. Consumers generally pay tariffs, but the economics can get a little fuzzier in certain things. Not for something like avocados or fresh produce. We're going to be paying that. So Americans really ticked off about grocery prices these days would be seeing higher food prices for things that we buy from Mexico and Canada. Oh, by the way, we buy a lot of beer from Mexico as well. So if you like Modelo, you're in trouble. I'm sorry. But then the supply chain thing is, I think, the other really interesting thing, and that is that
you talked about like a car seat.
Yeah, right. So NAFTA has been in place for several decades now, and American manufacturers have really teamed up with Canadian and Mexican manufacturers to create effectively a North American manufacturing region, and wherein each country specializes in certain things. And goods can cross borders multiple times before entering into a finished product. And cars are really the ultimate example of this. American auto parts manufacturers export billions of dollars to Mexico. And then Mexican manufacturers will put those auto parts into American cars and then ship them back to the United States. We do the exact opposite thing where Mexican parts come into the United States as well. Like you said, a car seat can actually cross the border 5 or 6 times before being put into a car. And because of that, and because of global supply chains generally, these very simplistic tariff analyses that you'll hear really don't work in an era of global supply chains, because effectively you often have companies trading with themselves, trading proprietary products. I mean, certain auto parts have been qualified. They've been, so a Ford auto part that is made in Mexico Ford's not going to suddenly go buy it from GM. They're not going to go to AutoZone down the street and buy it either. So these are the types of things that at the end of the day, you just end up raising costs for manufacturers, raising costs for American manufacturers, and hurting the very people that the tariffs are supposedly trying to help. And that's why when you actually look at the analyses of what high tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, or actually really almost anywhere, they actually end up hurting American manufacturers. That yes, some manufacturers will enjoy higher profits, more output, but a lot of manufacturers that rely on imported inputs, which by the way is almost all American manufacturers today, especially the big ones, they're just going to have higher costs, and those higher costs are either going to be passed on to consumers. They're either going to be taken out of future investments or future wages, or they're just going to mean, lower output or outright bankruptcy for American manufacturers.
But let me ask you about this as a negotiating tactic, because what some people would say is this: the United States is the biggest consumer market in the world.
Yeah.
So if I'm a foreign company, I want to sell into the United States, and there's a lot of folks here who say, hey, that's a privilege for you to be able to sell into our domestic market. If you're going to get the right to do that, then we want you to actually come our way on certain things we care about. So for example, we want you to lower some of the tariffs in your home country. We're talking about the foreign country here. To the extent that you're keeping some of our companies out of your country, we want you to open up the market and let them in. If we have this thing other foreign companies really want, which is access to this massive consumer market, shouldn't we drive a tough bargain to let people come into it?
Yeah, well, there's a few problems. The most basic problem is that you're effectively holding the gun to your own head trying to negotiate. It's like, Blazing Saddles, wonderful movie. It's really funny when he does that, but we know that intuitively that that's not the best negotiating strategy. So when you threaten tariffs on imports, you're actually threatening to harm your own economy, not only because of the supply chains, but because of deadweight losses, higher consumer prices, all that kind of stuff.
What are deadweight losses?
Deadweight loss is, sorry, that's an economic term. It just basically means that tariffs will increase what we call producer surplus, meaning protected producers will produce more, but it will reduce consumer surplus, the benefit we get as either consuming manufacturers, as individuals, by more than producers gain. That is just money destroyed. So nobody wins. And so the economy overall ends up worse off because of the tariff. And we call that, again, great loss. So nobody gets it. It's just destroyed. So in general, tariffs slow the economy. They reduce investment, types of things you don't want. So that's the first problem. You're kind of threatening yourself to negotiate. Now, that said, it's undoubtedly true that the United States is a big import market, a valuable consumer market. But there are a few flaws in the idea that we can just use tariffs to get what we want in international negotiations. The first is that manufacturers and importers and governments are pretty smart about finding ways around tariffs. So, for example, we put a bunch of tariffs on Chinese imports because we wanted the Chinese to change their government policies. Well, those tariffs reduced Chinese imports directly. But what we've seen in the data, totally unsurprisingly, is that Chinese imports started going to places like Vietnam or Mexico or India or elsewhere, and then they were incorporated into a refrigerator or whatever there, and then shipped to the United States as made in Vietnam products. That's totally legal. And so the Chinese content has still made it into the United States, just around the tariff. This type of tariff engineering is very common, totally legal. The other problem is that governments don't like to be told what to do. And they oftentimes, for their own political reasons, don't back down. Instead, they retaliate. So when we applied tariffs on steel and aluminum from all these different countries during the first administration, well, Canada and Mexico, which really rely on the US market, they didn't just back down. What did they do? They applied tariffs on American exports. In general, the tariffs that the Trump administration applied last time around didn't open markets. They didn't get reform. Instead, led to a bunch of retaliation, which makes us even worse off than before. And then the third and final problem is that we actually have and have long used tools to open foreign markets, and they're called free trade agreements. Whether it's NAFTA or the US-Korea free trade agreement, we have about 15 others. We were negotiating another one called the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump walked away from, and President Biden unfortunately didn't jump back into. Well, what does this say? It says we're going to give you more access to our market, not just in goods trade, because, by the way, there's a ton of trade done in services, particularly digitally. America has these globally dominant services firms. We're going to give you more access to our market in all these areas. You're going to give us more access to your market in all these areas. And at the end of the day, we're going to liberalize between 98 and 99% of all trade. You get to protect a few sensitive things politically on your end. We'll protect a few sensitive things on our end. But at the end of the day, we're going to greatly liberalize trade. And oh, by the way, that's going to greatly increase trade. And you see that U.S. exports to FTA partners increased far more over the last couple decades than to other countries. So this whole tariffs as a negotiating strategy thing, just beyond everything I just said, totally ignores that we had this imperfect but still pretty effective way to open foreign markets without all the collateral damage. And unfortunately, we seem to have abandoned that in recent years.
But what do you do then about a country like China? Because here's a situation where, about 25 years ago, we admitted them into the WTO, World Trade Organization, and the bargain was pretty simple. We're going to let China into, call it the rules-based international trading order, and this is going to open their economy. It's going to help ours. We even hoped and thought it might open them up politically.
Yeah.
The problem is we know now that China just ignores lots of these rules. So they steal our intellectual property, and not just for DVDs you used to buy on the street 15 years ago. This is really sensitive industrial and military technology. They produce really cheap things that are subsidized by the government and they sell it over here. That's called dumping. So here's my question to you. Let's accept your premise that, well, tariffs can be really counterproductive, even against somebody as tough to deal with as China. Then what tools could or should the incoming administration use to force some behavioral changes on China? Because I think most people agree with the premise that China is doing a lot of things that really aren't fair.
Yeah.
As it
Yeah.
relates-
So there's a few things to unpack there. The first is, and it's not the most important, but I think it's still important to note up front that China did radically liberalize its economy in the 1990s and into the 2000s as part of its entry into the WTO. And it was that market-based liberalization, including dramatically lowering its tariff rates from an average of around 30-something% to around 6%. It was that liberalization that was the primary driver of Chinese export competitiveness. So China got great in global markets, mainly because they did the privatization and other things, other market-based reforms that we wanted them to do. Yes, there is industrial policy and industrial subsidization, but that's really secondary. And even US lowering some trade barriers was secondary to those market-based reforms. That was really the rocket fuel for China's economy. So in one sense, we're kind of complaining about them doing what we wanted them to do. Now, that said, there certainly is bad behavior, economic behavior, human rights issues that the Chinese Communist Party undertakes. And in that sense, we need to really have a few strategies. For some stuff, we need to just say, we don't care, right? Chinese tiki torches are not a national security issue. The United States is not going to become a great economic power because we manufacture tiki torches. And yet we have 25% tariffs right now on Chinese and baby blankets and breast pumps and all this other type of junky stuff that has no nexus to industrial policy, intellectual property theft, or anything else we care about, right? So we need to start with some of this stuff and say, look, if the Chinese government wants to subsidize my consumption of a lot of these low value goods, clothing is another example that the United States is not going to make and shouldn't be making as an advanced economy, we should say fine. For the rest, and this is a much narrower ban, then you need to have a more sophisticated approach. For things that really are national security issues, just ban them from the US market. For things that have a human rights violations, slave labor, ban them from the US market. We've long had laws that ban goods made from slave labor. There's a new law related to the Uyghurs in China. You're not going to see me get real upset about any of these types of things, right? And then there's these edge cases where these aren't tanks and planes, but they might have security related purposes. They might be tied to intellectual property issues. Well, those require a much more systematic and strategic approach based on what actually works in changing Chinese government behavior and what doesn't. And tariffs really just don't work very well when it comes to changing Chinese government behavior. Again, we've had these Trump era tariffs in place now for 6+ years. Chinese government industrial policy and the rest has actually gotten worse over this time. It hasn't gotten better. The Chinese have not suddenly said, you got us, and they're changing their policies. By contrast, what has worked in the past is negotiation and disputes at the World Trade Organization. So believe it or not, when the United States brought a bunch of cases against the Chinese government policies at the World Trade Organization, which, China is a member, the Chinese government, when it lost, would generally reform the offending policies. Now, why did China do that? Are they just being nice? No, they value being seen as a good member in good standing in the global economic community. They value that kind of multilateral pressure of a bunch of governments teaming up against them. And it generally worked. The problem in the United States is that we didn't bring enough cases. We didn't follow up on cases. And we haven't brought any in years, again, going this kind of unilateral route. And then finally, I would note that we do have laws in the United States related to dumping and subsidization. And those laws have issues. I've written a lot about some of the flaws in these laws, but in general, the idea that the United States is just helpless, that we need blanket tariffs on tiki torches to stop Chinese dumping just isn't true. I mean, we have laws that do this. There are hundreds of special anti-dumping duties on Chinese imports based on this. So we, again, need to kind of have a more clear-headed approach about what's out there, what works, and what doesn't.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, the last big question I wanted to ask you is this, which is, who has the authority to jack up these tariffs? And there is some real dispute about that because, you know, if you look at the Constitution, really it vests that power in Congress mostly. Subsequently, in the last 50 years, there's been a couple different laws in which Congress kind of gradually gave a lot of that power back to the president. So I guess the question is, when President-elect Trump is sworn in on the 20th, and he says, all right, I want across the board 10% tariffs. In your view, can he do that? Or does Congress need to have some role in signing off on it?
Yeah. So it's complicated. I think that my view is that there are enough laws on the books that are written in a very vague way that give the president plausible case to apply global tariffs. Now, the laws are not intended to be used in the ways that they would in that way. There would certainly be litigation. But do I think that a creative lawyer armed with these laws that the Congress has passed over the years that delegate the president these vast trade powers, often on national security grounds, do I think that a good lawyer could come up with a reason to do that? Yes. Do I think that President Trump would have any qualms about abusing these laws in that manner? No. So I think that the first answer is, yeah, I think there's a way to do this. The second question, and I think most legal scholars, I should note, agree with me on that. Where we disagree more is what the courts would do. Some think that the courts would look at these laws and look at the proposals from President Trump and say, yeah, sorry, the law doesn't allow for that. We're striking this down. That would still take a couple of years, and the tariffs might be in place for those couple of years, but the president would eventually lose. Others, including me, are less sure of that result because the courts, including the Supreme Court, have really been extremely reluctant to check presidential power when it comes to national security and foreign policy. Because even if it is a delegated power like tariffs, the national security element dovetails with the president's Article 2 powers. And the president has a lot of authority in that space, constitutional authority. So even in a Supreme Court like we have now that is actually quite skeptical of these very broad delegations of congressional power to the president, they still would probably not want to be looking at trade policy and national security policy as the case that changes doctrine on delegation. And so in general, my view is that while I don't think these laws should be used that way, while I think it would be a grave abuse of said laws that has all sorts of economic and geopolitical damage, I think probably Trump could get away with it.
Okay. Let's get to some questions. And if you could just say your name and where you're from and ask away. Let's start with Jim. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you. So, Scott, I have a question about unintended consequences, and I want to talk about munitions for a minute. I'm reading that we can't even produce enough munitions to supply Ukraine in their war, and we're trying to get it ramped up. Meanwhile, we're buying gunpowder from Poland and India and South Korea. If we tariff goods coming in, aren't we exacerbating that problem? We can't even supply Ukraine. What if we get in trouble? How are we going to manage that?
Yeah. So this gets back, I think, to a very important point about how even defense related goods have a lot of global supply chain implications, right? And that tariffs are, I always say, tariffs are a 19th century tool applied to a 21st century economy. And they don't tend to work well because of all of these complexities, right? So, in general, I do have concerns that a global tariff, by undermining manufacturing capabilities in the United States, might actually harm national security, the defense industrial base, and the rest. But I will note this, that again, national security is a legitimate reason to have protectionist measures for certain things, whether it's buy American rules or domestic subsidies and that kind of thing. So when it comes to the defense supply chain, there are some flaws that have been revealed, I think, whether it is in how government procurement is handled, whether it is how our defense related treaties with other countries, or whether it is related to certain domestic industrial capacity that we should have, subsidize it or whatever. That is a bit different from kind of a classic free market case for open trade, right? We need to have a slightly different approach. It doesn't mean we need global tariffs, but it does mean we should be a little more, and even a guy like me is going to be a little more welcoming for government economic interventions in that space.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. John, over to you.
John, you're muted.
Oh yeah, I knew I was muted. I was trying to unmute.
Oh, got it.
Thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your perspective. One editorial comment and one question. Editorial comment is, we have always, if we look back and learn nothing, we have been very short-sighted about our involvement in the global economy in terms of strategic and defense components and materials, and we have not strategically thought very well. I think that's maybe the revelation that we're discovering as the complexities of potential tariffs come more and more out in the light, such as you've shared. The Chinese are great at long-term thinking. We're we're great at 4-year thinking in order to get elected, and so somehow or another we've got to have a different discourse. Having said that, I am of the general opinion that at least when it comes to Mexico, and I'm just going to pick on Mexico for just a second, something drastic possibly needs to be done in order to get Mexican government motivated significantly enough to stop fentanyl and stop illegals. Because now, don't get me wrong, we have our own responsibilities to do that, and which has become grossly evident the lack of government stopping that in the last 4 years. So, but I think it's ultimately worth it to potentially suffer the harm of avocados and freaking beer in order to get the Mexicans' attention to do more than they're doing. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So first, I have to note, John, go Rangers. Big Rangers fan here. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. On to your questions. I'll start with the Mexico stuff. First, it's a lot more than avocados and beer. When you're talking about a $450 billion a year trade relationship between the United States and Mexico, you're talking about taxing that at rates that would cause massive harm, not just to food prices, but to American manufacturing supply chains. And a lot of American workers, not to mention the US economy more broadly. That's probably not the way to get the Mexican government to comply, particularly given the economic implications there, with immigration or drug policy, which is somewhat disconnected from, well, very disconnected from those things. The second point, though, is that, I mean, my view is that, look, we have drug problems and immigration problems mainly because of domestic policy, not because of Mexican government policy. And again, I think it's a bad approach to harm our own economy and a lot of American consumers to affix what is effectively an American policy issue far more, dealing with immigration reform, drug policy, and the rest. It's a bit like shooting the messenger. Finally, though, I would note there is a really important role for trade to play in the immigration debate, particularly in Central America, because increased trade with Central America has been shown to reduce pressure on Central Americans to move north and try to cross the border illegally. A recent study found that just simply liberalizing trade in apparel with Central American countries would slow border crossings by several 100,000 per year. So there are things that we can do, but taxing Mexican imports seems like a very bad one to achieve what can be laudable goals.
Thanks, Scott. Stephen. You are on mute, Stephen.
I know, and I'm trying to, but it says you're not allowing. Okay, now I'm good. Steve Whelan, New York City, and a longtime supporter of the Cato Institute. My question arises from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which released just this morning options to raise tariff revenue.
Yeah.
One of the more intriguing lines is that even under dynamic scoring, a 10% baseline tariff, excluding free trade agreement countries, nevertheless would produce 1.1 trillion, admittedly over a 10-year period, but it's a start. That's $100 billion a year that we can use to cutting back on the Biden inflation deficits. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you always have to consider. Well, first of all, I saw that this morning, and they also warned of pretty significant economic consequences of those tariffs as well. So we first need to start there. Yes, you can raise money, but you would have broader economic harms from this, including higher prices, but also, again, all the other things we discussed. And as that analysis noted, foreign retaliation against American exports and other things. So, the second, though, is when you're talking about tax policy and the budget issues we have, you also need to think of alternatives to the type of revenue raisers that tariffs could be. And in terms of tax policy, you want to find the least harmful tax. Tariffs are just a really bad way to raise revenue for several reasons. They have a very narrow base, a narrow tax base because it's only applied to imports. Imports are a very small share of all consumption, a very small share of our economy relatively, especially compared to something like wages. So you need high rates. High rates, though, encourage evasion, make it hard to enforce. Tariffs are also not transparent. They're applied at the border. They're soaked up through supply chains. That's another negative for tax policy. And tariffs are known to induce all sorts of these additional distortions and unintended consequences. So if you're a guy like me who wants sound tax policy and applies certain principles, transparency, broad base, low rate, few loopholes, easy to enforce, tariffs achieve none of those objectives. So even though, yes, they can raise some money, you always have to consider the alternatives to raising that same amount. And there are a lot better alternatives out there, including, I should note, since you're a Cato guy, you'll know my colleague Adam Michel released a big report looking at all of the loopholes in our tax code, all of the subsidies in our tax code. You can start with stuff like that instead of applying a new layer of taxation that has all those distortions mentioned via tariff.
Scott, one thing I'd mention, because you pointed this out previously, speaking of loopholes, you also talk about the tariff exclusion process.
Yeah.
Say a new tariff comes in, and now the lobbyists start going to work trying to say, hey, great tariff, but don't include us in it for this reason. So
Right.
that's another distortion you're talking about.
Yeah, and this gets to that political dysfunction part of the equation that you mentioned before, that tariffs, going back to the 19th century, tariffs are a notorious tool for cronyism and outright corruption because they're applied on foreign goods and they're hidden taxes and they're really complicated. And so you see throughout history that tariff policy is always accompanied lots of lobbying and cronyism and the rest. And the Trump tariffs were no exception. You had this huge exclusion process that had an explosion of lobbying attached to it. You're seeing right now, there's a quote in the Financial Times the other day that said, the only big winners from the future tariff debates are going to be the lawyers, lobbyists, and accountants, right? And that is just the nature of these things, is such that there's going to always be a ton of lobbying attached. And I would note, if you care about small businesses, this is particularly bad for smaller businesses that can't afford the high-priced lawyers and lobbyists, that don't have alternative supply chains that they can just reroute goods. They're the ones that are going to be most harmed by this policy, not guys like GM or Boeing, who has an army of very well-compensated, smart people who are going to figure out how to get around this stuff, and including by lining the pockets of folks in Washington.
We got two more questions. Let's start with Michael. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. And I'm in Ohio. Well, a lot of people think that trade deficits are bad. But what I think most people don't realize is that every dollar of trade deficit translates into a dollar of foreign investment. And that's not something you've talked about today. Yeah. But I think if people understood that, there'd be a lot less opposition to free trade. So perhaps you can explain that.
Sure. So this is a great point, and it's something we bring up all the time, particularly because President Trump uses the trade deficit or the trade balance as a scoreboard. So he thinks we're winning in trade if we have a surplus. He thinks we're losing in trade if we have a deficit. But like you said, that's actually not the economic reality. First, as we've already talked about, imports can benefit a lot of manufacturers. They can benefit economic growth. But second is, as you said, when I buy a television made in Mexico, and my dollars go to Mexico, those dollars don't get put under the mattress in Mexico or set on fire. They are going to be spent or invested. And they can only be spent or invested, with very few exceptions, in the United States. So they can buy American products. So that's where our trade balance comes in. Or they can be invested in a factory, or they can buy US debt. And that capital flow tends to balance exactly with our current account or the trade balance. So what you see is if we have a $1 billion trade deficit, we have a $1 billion capital surplus at the same time. So yeah, that's a really important point that we bring up all the time. And you're right that when people learn this fact, they actually do change their mind about the trade deficit. Now, how do I know that? Well, we at Cato actually commissioned polling over the summer as part of our globalization project. And we asked people about this. We said, do you think the trade deficit is good or bad? Majority instantly bad. We said, do you think the trade deficit is good or bad if you learned that every dollar sent abroad is eventually reinvested in the United States? And it completely flipped. Suddenly a majority said, trade deficit's fine. So you're right that that's a critically important point. I'll just add though, politics is about 10-second sound bites and not economics lessons. And it's a very hard lesson to teach, particularly for folks that hear every month about the trade deficit and hear that it's a drag on growth because that's how it's reported often. So it's a really tough nut to crack. But yeah, it'd be great if we could crack it.
Thanks, Scott. And Jeffrey.
Hi, Scott. Brian, I have actually three different questions. Can I throw at least one out at a time, and you can tell me whether you want to go to the next one? But the first question is, from what I hear you saying, Scott, you don't think that the Trump administration will have enough economic sophistication to use tariffs effectively? And paraphrasing that is essentially it would be just another big government boondoggle program.
Why don't we go for 2 and 3, Jeffrey? Maybe you can answer them all at once. So one is it's going to be an economic boondoggle. Thoughts?
And is there enough sophistication within the administration to manage it effectively?
Okay.
The second is, what do across the board tariffs do to our friends? And does it increase the drive to make the dollar no longer the economic currency of choice for the world? And the third question goes back to Mexico. They have complained that our guns are being shipped and used by the cartels, sort of like a reverse tariff situation. What might happen to that and as part of the bargaining chips? So those are the three.
So lot to unpack there, Scott. But basically, one, do you think that there's enough sophistication and nuance on the Trump team to implement these tariffs? 2, do you think there's a threat to the dollar's status as reserve currency if we go too far with the tariffs? And 3, do we think U.S. guns going into Mexico might in some way play a factor in any of this?
Yeah, so I'm going to pass on 3 because I don't really have a good answer, but I can hit 1 and 2 actually together. And the short answer is on the sophistication is, look, I think there are some smart people on the Trump team, including Scott Bessent, the future Treasury Secretary, and Howard Lutnick, the future Commerce Secretary. The question, though, is do they really have any power over this stuff, or is it just going to be Trump driving the bus? The Journal just a couple of days ago issued a new report showing that nobody knew about Trump's tweets about Canada and Mexico and the new 25% tariffs. Well, they're technically truths, but you get the idea, right? His new posts. And what we saw during the last Trump administration, was that a lot of U.S. trade policy came from Donald Trump's head and then was justified in retrospect by creative bureaucrats. So, originally, Bob Lighthizer, our former USTR, just wanted the China tariffs to be on about $50 to $60 billion worth of Chinese trade, very targeted on certain products. They only went up to 300 billion because Trump started tweeting about increasing them once the Chinese government retaliated. So things totally went off the rails. So the reason we have tariffs on Chinese tiki torches today isn't strategy. It's Trump tweeted it. So, and that I think dovetails nicely with the currency question because I think one of the big questions about the future, the next couple of years, is not whether we get tariffs. I think we're going to get tariffs. It's what comes after that, because increased tariffs will generally strengthen the US dollar. That's kind of a standard macro issue. More tariffs, you actually get a stronger dollar. Now, that's going to offset some of the cost of the tariffs for consumers, but it might actually make the dollar a little more attractive in global markets because of its strength. But it's going to undermine the efficacy of the tariffs themselves because it's going to make American exports more expensive in foreign markets, going to make foreign imports less expensive in the U.S. market. And the question then becomes, does Donald Trump then demand for currency controls or other types? Because there have some in the Trump administration orbit that have said we need a weaker dollar, even though Trump wants a stronger one too. So I think that's where things get a lot murkier. If the United States responds to the failure of the trade deficit to shrink because of tariffs, because it's not going to shrink because of tariffs. That's also a big macro lesson for those out there. Do they say, oh, we need to manage the dollar? And if you start managing the dollar, that's where things can get very bad. And that's where I think global investors might actually start running away from the dollar. And that has all sorts of other bad implications. Now, we just don't know. So, that's one of kind of the big unknowns for 2025 and beyond is what happens next, assuming we get the tariffs, which at least some of them I think is a given.
Well, Scott, you gave us a ton to think about. We're going to have somebody on tomorrow who's going to rebut every single thing you said.
Totally wrong. They'll be totally wrong.
But we appreciate you so much before the holiday coming on, sharing some of your insights, and certainly we'll be watching closely early next year to see how this all evolves. Scott Lincicome, Cato Institute, thank you for joining us on No Labels Talks.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for listening in, and we'll see you very soon on the next edition of No Labels Talks.